You know, I think one of the hardest things to admit to yourself is that you're unhappy in a relationship that technically isn't bad. Nobody's cheating. Nobody's screaming. Nobody's throwing things. And there's no dramatic betrayal. Nothing that would make your friends immediately tell you to leave. It's just lonely. And I don't think people talk about that often enough. I think a lot of us grow up believing that relationships only end because of some huge event, some obvious disaster. But sometimes a relationship starts hurting because of 1,000 tiny things that nobody else can see. And that's a much harder thing to explain. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, about what it feels like when a relationship slowly becomes one-sided. Because it doesn't happen overnight. At least it didn't for me. At first, I didn't even notice it. Or maybe I noticed it and made excuses for it. I'd send the first text because they were busy. I'd make the plans because they were tired. I'd start the conversations because they weren't great at communicating. And honestly, that felt normal. Relationships aren't always 50-50 every single day. Sometimes one person needs more support. Sometimes life gets overwhelming. And I understood that. The problem was that the pattern never changed. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. And eventually I started realizing something. If I stopped reaching out, nothing happened. And that's a really painful thing to discover. Because nobody prepares you for that feeling. Nobody prepares you for the moment you decide not to text first, just to see what happens. Not because you're playing games or trying to manipulate anybody. You just want reassurance that they'd think about you too. That they'd reach for you the way that you keep reaching for them. And then hours pass. And then it's a day, sometimes longer. And you're sitting there trying to convince yourself not to be hurt. Trying to tell yourself that you're just overreacting. They're busy. You know, there's a perfectly reasonable explanation. Meanwhile, a tiny voice in your head keeps asking the question that you don't want to hear. If I stop putting in effort completely, would this relationship survive? That's a terrifying question. Because once it enters your mind, it's really hard to get rid of. I remember spending so much time wondering whether I was asking for too much. I think a lot of women do that. We become experts at questioning ourselves. Maybe I'm too emotional. Maybe I'm too needy. Maybe my expectations are unrealistic. Maybe I'm asking for more than anyone can give. And then I'd stop and actually think about what I wanted. I wasn't asking for somebody to spend every second with me. I wasn't asking for constant attention. I didn't even want expensive gifts or grand romantic gestures. I just wanted a text, maybe a phone call, a little excitement to see me, maybe a little curiosity about how my day went. I wanted to feel like I crossed someone's mind without having to remind them that I existed. And honestly, that doesn't seem unreasonable. I think one of the saddest things about one-sided relationships is how invisible the work becomes. The emotional labor, the remembering, checking in, planning, the worrying, and the effort. People see the relationship and assume that both people are contributing equally. But they don't see the person quietly carrying most of it. They don't see the reminders being sent, conversations being started, or the plans being organized. All that emotional maintenance happening behind the scenes. It's exhausting. And the worst part is that you often don't realize how exhausted you are until you stop. Until one day you sit down and think, why am I so tired all the time? And the answer is because you've been carrying two people's share of the relationship. I think that's what loneliness inside of a relationship feels like. Not being physically alone, being emotionally alone. Having someone in your life but still feeling unseen, disconnected. Like you're standing in the middle of a room waving your arms while nobody notices. And that's confusing because you can love someone and still feel lonely. You can care about someone deeply and still feel neglected. Those things can exist at the same time. For a long time I thought if I just tried harder, things would get better. If I communicated more clearly, if I was more patient, if I gave them more time, if I became easier to love somehow. But eventually I had to face something uncomfortable. Love isn't supposed to require one person to do all the work. A relationship isn't supposed to survive entirely because one person refuses to let it die. And I think that's the realization that hurts the most. Realizing that effort matters, not just love, not just intentions, effort. Because you can love someone, but if you're the only one showing up every day, eventually you start running out of energy. You start running out of hope. You start running out of reasons to keep convincing yourself that things will change. And then the guilt shows up. And the guilt is awful. Because now you're wondering if you're selfish for wanting more. You start feeling guilty for being disappointed, for feeling neglected, for even considering whether the relationship is making you happy anymore. But happiness matters. Feeling valued matters. Feeling chosen matters. And I think sometimes we stay in situations far longer than we should because we're waiting for a dramatic reason to leave. Some undeniable proof. An obvious sign. When really the truth might be much simpler. Maybe you're just tired of feeling alone. Maybe you're tired of being the only one trying. Maybe you're tired of carrying a relationship that was never meant to be carried by one person. And maybe that's enough. Not because anyone is a villain or evil, but because relationships are partnerships. They're supposed to feel shared. And if you've been doing all the emotional heavy lifting for so long that you're starting to forget what it feels like to be cared for, then maybe that's worth paying attention to. I don't have all the answers. I'm still figuring a lot of this out myself. But I know this. Nobody should have to earn basic effort from someone who claims to love them. Nobody should have to beg to feel important. And nobody should spend years wondering whether they're asking for too much, when all they're really asking for is to be met halfway. Sometimes halfway is all we ever wanted.